Hey everybody, Ty Glover, Think Different Nation. Thanks for coming into the channel again. I thought this was a great spot to talk about Castaway, Tom Hanks. And if you remember the movie, he actually was working for FedEx. You saw him in the beginning working over in Moscow. Really heavy hitter. This guy made things happen. Next thing you know, he's back in the States. I think it's around Christmas time. He has to catch a flight. There's something that needs to be transported from one location to another location. So he's with his family, they're having dinner, he's with his fiance. He takes his flight. It was the flight that changed the course of his life, the course of his direction. Now, a couple things I wanted to point out here in this particular movie. First thing is, when the plane is experiencing troubles over the Pacific Ocean, somewhere they say near Mauritius or near the Fiji Islands rather, the pilot comes out, talks about specifically the fact that we lost traffic control and therefore we lost him several hours ago. We've been flying blind. The second thing that he talks about is the fact that we're potentially off course. He mentions those key things as everybody's kind of hunkering down to get ready for what's getting ready to come. Fast forward. Now you have Tom Hanks, who's actually landed. He's in the ground. He's survived. He's on the island. He's big. He's got a lot of weight on him, which means he's had a very rich life back in Tennessee. But now he's having to go and actually survive. These are new tactics, new survival skills he just did not come with. But he's got other things in his tool chest. So he's figuring his way around this island. And as a matter of fact, on a sidebar point, they actually stopped production of this movie for roughly 6 months to allow Tom Hanks to move off set, to go back home and to lose the weight so he can get into his lean body mode, which is the next scene where he comes back into the movie and he's now lean. He's been on the island for several years. Okay, I digress. Now, you've got Tom Hanks. He's lean now. He's been able to figure out everything from the standpoint of creating fire to a continuous supply of food. So if you think about it from the standpoint of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, he's now got a ready supply of water. He can source the water. He knows how to get it. He therefore also has his supply of food. He knows what he can eat on the island. He knows where it is. This man can survive. He can be in it for the long term. But the one thing you notice on the cave, obviously, is Wilson. Or is it Spalding? I'm not sure which one. But he's got that ball there. And this ball becomes his best friend because he needs to be able to focus his attention and have communications with someone on that island while he's there. He's in that cave, and you'll notice, especially on this part right here, he's watching the pattern of the rotation of the Earth around the sun by watching that little spot of light that's appearing on that rock face in that cave. And he's watching it every single day at probably a specific hour of the day based on high noon, and he sees the movement of that dot across that rock in a figure-8 form, which means he's seeing the transitioning around the Earth for a full complete cycle of 365 days, and he's seeing it multiple times. But he's also seeing the little check marks there that he's outlined from the standpoint of the seasons. Winter, spring, summer, fall, meaning September, October, December, January, and so forth. He's got it mapped out because he needs to know where he is. Now, what's the math that they use to actually figure that out?
I think that we are right here for about an hour. So that's a distance of, what, 1,000 times pi? They think that we are right here.
Well, Tom Hanks walked into this scene with critical skills, or rather his character, should we say, walked into that scene with very critical skills. A, he understood the theory of pi. B, he had critical math skills from the standpoint of being able to figure out the circumference of the Earth. He had an understanding of how far, in fact, that plane had moved off course after they lost contact with ground control. Therefore, he was able to figure out the perimeter of the total search around where he might be. He was able to also figure out the fact that he may be 100,000 miles search radius outside of the area, which means they're not going to find him because he's too far outside of the radius of the actual search area that they were looking in. But he's got the mathematical ability. He's got the recognition of pi, 3.14159. He's got the actual understanding of the circumference of a circle. He's got the calculations for that. He can go into detail and calculate out where I am with respect to where they may have been, and therefore he quickly understands that I'm not going to survive this. So he goes through a number of different other phases in his life where he's trying to figure out, what do I do? He even moves towards the thought process of suicide. You see at the end there where he's got the rope, you don't hear it until the end, but that was his thought process, suicide. I can't die here alone. I'd rather be in control of something. But then finally, He's been watching the actual movement of that little dot of sunshine directly on the rock face within the cave itself. And by watching that and by having the one commodity that is irreplaceable, time, he's been able to watch that star movement, or rather watch the Earth's rotation around the sun for several years, detecting everything around him, watching it, seeing the seasons pass, watching the actual movement of the currents itself within the ocean, and seeing when the wind shifts, because the wind shift is so valuable and important. But he's not willing to give, or at least he's not willing to leave his life to chance and just staying on that island. So that's the key thing there. He has the survival skills, and he pulls from all these key points in his reference of time and understanding to be able to put those survival skills to good use. If he didn't know that information, or perhaps lost contact with that information, then he would have no connective reference point to even understand the seasons. But he had that. The next thing, he has to get out. He recognizes by watching, by time, and by patience, because that's all he had, was that the current moves in a different direction. At some part of the season within the year, it's flowing and pushing one way, towards the island, which means it's inescapable. But he's also seeing the fact that at another part of the year, based on watching that celestial calendar, or at least plotting on the stone, that in fact at another point in the year, it moves outwards, which means if he can find the sail, he can perhaps build a life raft to take them out of the circumference of that coral reef. That's what he finds in the porta potty. So now, if you're wondering, why is all this important? I mean, I've had conversations with my daughter where they're sitting in math class and chemistry or whatever. They don't like being there. That's not their area of focus or core competence or interest. But why is this important? Well, it's all about math. There are only a certain number of calculations that were required to be able to figure out where he was. A certain number of pieces of information, such as pi, such as the formula for the actual diameter, and being able to understand those specific geometric formulas to be able to understand where he was in that specific place and time. Now, for you, that may not come in as being necessary, especially if you're sitting in Philadelphia or LA. But for him, that key point of information was something he was able to grab, whether it was from college or high school or whatever, because maybe he had an interest in mathematics, and therefore he captured that piece, he stored that away, and he was able to leverage that. He probably never used that at all at any other point in his life other than to recognize the fact that he can get off that freaking island. Points of information create opportunities for connection. That's the importance of that piece. But what other pieces of potentially valuable information are you coming up with, or at least are you passing by not actively observing, simply because you don't think it matters? Those are the key details. But if you look at it at a macro level, you don't even really need to have the details. He didn't necessarily need to know anything else more about geometry to be able to figure his way out of that situation. Math is rules-based, which means if you know the rules, you will find the answer. And that's the valuable piece about that. Most of life is rules-based. If you know the rules, or if you know the process steps, which is essentially what rules are, then you can figure out the answer to map yourself into a different course or into a different direction of your life.
So actually, what pieces did I connect to actually create a new path for my life? Well, one of the first discoveries, or connections, should we say, came from the understanding of a gentleman by the name of Dr. Howard Gardner, Harvard University professor. He actually went to Harvard when he was a student. But he came up with this theory of multiple intelligences that I could definitely identify and see myself within the world of. And the way the theory of multiple intelligences works is that people aren't born with just one type of intelligence that we normally focus in on is, well, they typically call it general intelligence, G. But people have multiple intelligences based on their experiences from the gene pool through epigenetics, but carried further through their experiences within the world. Let's say the first one, the naturalist. The naturalist is a person who actually has a recognition in the classification of numerous species, for example, of flora and fauna. These people are the ones who understand the environment around them, whether it's in fact the plant life, the actual animal life, the skies, the nature, how nature moves around, how you experience that world within that specific environment. A person from, for example, Alaska would have a different experience than a person from Borneo, but nonetheless, they are all naturalists. By developing that understanding of what you're good at, people move into certain areas. For example, a naturalist might be that botanist or that biologist, possibly astronomers, meteorologists, or geologists. These are the people that actually are looking at the big picture and understanding their part and their environment's role within the bigger picture. Now, that's a naturalist. The second one, for example, Bodily kinetics, that's body smart. That's understanding your body's potential, your body's maximum capabilities. You're able to push yourself to a limit. You know yourself from the standpoint of the diet and how it affects you, for example, or the exercise that you do, or even the psychological processes that you go through for calming down your body, or even the food that you take in, such as Tom Brady, for example. You always hear about his diet. This guy is very controlled from the standpoint of the way he manages his food and therefore the way he manages his body. So that's bodily kinetics. The next one, spatial intelligence. People with high spatial intelligence understand the big picture. The smart picture is what they call it, or picture smart. They have the potential to recognize and manipulate patterns of wide space and can process information surrounding objects existing within the space. For example, your sculptors who are able to three-dimensionally carve out objects from within a space. Also pilots, they see big picture, they see big sky. Architects, graphic artists, people who use that visual side and understand relationships of one thing within another. People with this intelligence have that ability to recognize and manipulate large-scale and fine-grained spatial images. So they have the ability to be able to process the information around them from the visual side of things and put it together, and again, place that object within the entire space of where it is. Linguistics. Linguistics smart. These are people that have a high sensitivity to language. They understand not necessarily just the verbal form of language, but also the written form and what it's expressing, as well as the body form, the actual images that we experience and take in from the standpoint of understanding a person's body movement. Now, in a linguistics person, they're good at law, for example, authors, journalists, curators, possibly going into politics and being politicians, although that moves on to another area as well that we'll talk about shortly. But the linguistics person has skills in this specific area that people that may be smart from the standpoint of reasoning and logic and critical thinking may not have that capability. So that's linguistics. Another one, interpersonal intelligence. The interpersonal person knows themselves, and that's the key here. And interesting enough, entrepreneurs are considered to be one of those intrapersonal people. They understand themselves. They understand their motivations, what drives them, and that's a key. Now, another one, interpersonal intelligence. These folks know other people. They have that capacity or that ability to understand intentions, motivations, desires. They can look at a person and they can have an experience with a person and understand a person's true motives or intentions just simply by the way that person fills that space and operates, the experience they have with that person. They can read, they can feel that person. Now, they say teachers, psychologists, managers, salespeople, people in public relations are good with that because they're good with understanding others. They're good with relating within the space. I'd also add that to politicians as well. The musical intelligence. It goes without saying it that people have natural skills from the standpoint of performance, composition, appreciation of musical patterns. They're able to put that information together from the standpoint of composing or creating music that is balanced with all the multiple parts of that music, such as recognizing musical pitch, the rhythm, the timbre, and the tone of that music itself. So they have that ability to discern, whereas most people don't. Of course, you're going to have your singers, your composers, your musicians, your DJs. They would fall into that spacing itself. Another one. Logical mathematical intelligence. It's numbers reasoning is what they call it. And these people are typically the ones who are known for having that high IQ score, that high intelligence. But logical mathematical intelligence refers to that capacity to be able to analyze problems logically and carry out mathematical operations and investigative issues scientifically. So it moves into that space where you have a specific discipline of mathematics and being able to understand and process critical thinking, even math thinking. The next one is the last one that was added. It's called the existential person, that person who understands or rather uses collective values of intuition to understand others in the world around them. For example, these are the people that according to universal laws would be using, for example, the mentalist intelligence. They have the sensitivity and the capacity to be able to tackle the deep questions about human existence, such as the meaning of life, why are we here, what happens when we die, how did we get here. They're reflective. And they do deep thinking and design abstract theories of things. Because if you think about it, all sciences came from reflective thought. Before we moved into actually studying science, we actually had philosophers. They studied, they were reflective. So at this point, you may be asking, well, so what does this have to do with instinctive advantages? Well, it wasn't until I recognized that we actually do have multiple ways of thinking that I recognized It's okay to think differently. We don't have to fall into that cookie cutter profile of that G or general intelligence, that I can have different types of intelligences myself, and that I recognize what my true strengths were. I recognize what my weaknesses were at one point as well, and I also recognize ways to deal with those weaknesses, to find solutions around it. I tell you, Google and the internet is a great equalizer from that standpoint. So I put together a grid to try to explain at least the way I find myself fitting within the multiple intelligences. And I've structured this survey based on those 9 different types of intelligences, but I've maxed out the actual answers to the questions to a max of 26. And what I've done is I've plotted my individual personal intelligences on that chart. So this is what you're going to see being rolled out. For example, music. I'm not a big music guy. I enjoy it when it's there, but I don't go actively seeking it, for example. When I'm in my car, I'm typically listening to an NPR or just something that's challenging me to help me to understand and connect more pieces. Spatial, very high on the spatial side. As mentioned, my goal is to be able to, within this vlog, to be able to help an understanding scale, and therefore understand the spatial aspects of things, the larger picture, physically, visually. Then it also is part of the other senses, and therefore understanding that bigger picture from all of the 5 senses plus that super sense. Existential. I think those go along with the spatial side of things. When you have a bigger picture of the physical or of the visual side, then you naturally develop that bigger understanding, or at least contemplation, the question of the more etherical. Then you naturally start seeking out the answers to the bigger question of why are we here, our existence itself. Naturalist, never really been a camper. I'm not necessarily focused on nature itself. I'm environmentally conscious and understanding, but I've never been really that naturalist. I actually hate bugs, so not really there. Linguistic side, relatively strong with the linguistic side. Just challenges there, but at least I had the understanding of the way my body impacts others around me. With NLP, I'm learning to be much stronger from a standpoint of linguistics. Now, the body kinetics. Bodily kinetics, I'm not necessarily a physical person. I exercise to sustain health, but I've never really been focused on the physical aspects of the body from the standpoint of challenging it. When I was in track, I remember running the mile or whatever we ran for whatever distance and throwing up afterwards. And I realized, or at least I thought at that time, that this isn't for me. Intrapersonal. The intrapersonal side is that inward view. I'm very big on the intrapersonal to understand how I am operating within the space. I'm getting much stronger in that area. So the next one is the interpersonal side, and this is where I really have challenges as well. As mentioned, I'm like painfully shy, but I can pretty much talk to anybody at a certain level. I just can't move to that next level of conversation. I don't know how to construct a conversation. That's just been a challenge that I've always had from an interpersonal side. People don't necessarily detect it, but that's just been one of my basic challenges. Lastly, we have the mathematical logical. The mathematical logic is one that I've really been able to grow, not necessarily even intending to grow it. It's just that my interest has been in that area around that space, and therefore I've naturally spent more time and I built up that area of my life. That's that critical thinking side of the reasoning, the rationalization piece that I didn't do evidently very well on that IQ test, as you saw on my first actual blog post. But I find myself leaning into it now, and at least on a theoretical level at this current time, it's a space of comfort for me. So while I've just mapped out my own personal intelligences, you don't know me, so you really can't get a gauge as to how all this works. So I figured, let me try to use someone that we probably all know, Chuck Nolan, from, again, Castaway, Tom Hanks. So as you can see here, in my opinion, this is where Tom Hanks first originally emerged before he got on that flight. These were his intelligence, or at least how I would have classified his intelligence just by viewing Castaway itself. Going from top clockwise, I'd say mathematically, he was high there. I mean, the guy definitely, right off the bat, he exactly knew how to calculate where potentially I am, what the range or what the search range was, and therefore how quickly or potentially could they find me. So he was good on the math side. I think there was something that he's naturally inclined to be good at. From the naturalist side, I just have to make deductions because obviously we don't know his whole story, but I can see traveling the way he travels, he doesn't eat well. He was overweight. Coming from logistics myself, I know he's also in a high pressure environment. So I don't think he really has a strong naturalist side at all, at least at this point. Bodily kinetics, very similar. The man is out of shape. So I don't think he's really strong in that area as well. From an existential side, really, again, hard to tell. There's no markers necessarily within his actions or within his role to be able to show what he was from an existential standpoint. You could get some glimpse from the standpoint of the relationship, or rather the strong relationship he had with his girlfriend, who's played by Helen Hunt. But that's all I could get. So I gave him kind of like a lukewarm score from an existential standpoint. But from an interpersonal standpoint, I think this guy was sharp. This guy knew how to work with people. He knew how to communicate. He knew how to make things happen. He was very strong from an interpersonal standpoint, at least what I could see on as far as his actions or his movements were concerned on set. Now, from an intrapersonal standpoint, I don't think there was a lot of time to be intrapersonal. I think he's definitely a much more outward person as opposed to being inward looking, an intrapersonal person. So, but again, still hard to tell. I still gave him a rather high score in the 20s range, 15 to 20 range. Musical? No idea there. The movie didn't show anything related to the musical side outside of him singing The Doors' Come On Baby Light My Fire towards the middle part of the show. Linguistics. Linguistics was high. The man was able to, again, rally teams, get crews together and make mountains move, getting packages on planes, making things happen. So from a linguistic standpoint, I gave him about a 20 on the linguistic side. Lastly, the spatial piece. There's no indication at all that he really had any understanding from a spatial standpoint. Again, considering the actual shots that were done in the story plotline, you couldn't really get a spatial aspect as far as his intelligence in that space is concerned. But let's take a look at Tom after the actual crash and after he's had some time to be able to survive on that island. He had to adapt. So starting off the bat, I don't think he lost anything from a mathematical standpoint. He would have had to use those skills to contemplate scenarios and possibilities. I can't necessarily call it out right off the bat, but this man is in thinking mode. He's in adapting mode. He's trying to find solutions, so he would have held strongly to his mathematical capabilities. He wouldn't have given those up. Naturalist. He grew from a naturalist standpoint. From a mathematical logic standpoint, you also saw him calculating out the Earth's movement, the difference in transitioning seasons, and therefore what would that bring to the island from a current standpoint, flow out and back in. That also translates to that naturalist style. He also had to adapt and learn to survive on that island with no skills. So he definitely had to adapt and grow in his naturalist capabilities. You saw he lost all that weight. And if you combine that with going back to that whole mathematical side as well, this guy's an observer now. He's watching. He's taking time from the standpoint of the seasons and the changes because he was understanding the tides, the way the wind would move around the actual island itself. From a bodily kinetic standpoint, he had to move in that direction. In order to survive, he got lean. He found a diet that, in fact, he could sustain him on that island. He found his water. So bodily kinetics, the man was moving. He was constantly moving to survive. From an existential standpoint, the man was on an island alone for 4 years. You can't help but to look into yourself, inside of yourself, and wonder about your existence here on this planet, especially when you're alone and you have so much time to yourself. That's all you got. The interpersonal side probably waned a bit since he didn't have that stimuli from other people coming into his space. He was alone. So that probably waned. Looking at the interpersonal probably increased. He had to do self-evaluations of what he was looking for, what he was willing to do to survive. Musical, I would imagine a man listened to every single plant move from a wind or bird or whatever was going on in an island and understood or at least started to pick up on sounds that were separate and different from just the waves crashing on the beach or the shoreline and the actual wind itself. Just like a train or a trolley living next to one, you constantly, or rather your brain will naturally phase that out. It will block it out. You won't hear it anymore. Probably the same thing with waves for him. He's looking for other patterns of sounds that might capture his attention. And I would imagine that's probably where he was from a music standpoint. He was looking for different tones, and he probably had to make his own music. So that's all I can say about that. Moving into the linguistic side, probably suffered somewhat again because all of his conversations were personal between him, Wilson, or again, what was it, Spaulding? And again, moving into spatial. I think he grew in that space simply because he had such wide vistas or views to stare out at. And therefore, he saw in bigger pictures than what he would have normally have seen in living in such a small, confined environment in Tennessee or traveling on that plane that he would, going from location to location. So as you can see from this graph here, he adapted, he changed, he grew. There's a common expression that nature abhors a vacuum. That means that when you remove something from nature, it will fill it with something else. In his situation, he lost that linguistics, at least slightly. He lost some of the interpersonal, but he gained in so many other ways because adaptation was required in order for survival to occur. He leveraged his instinctive advantages, especially associated with the mathematical logic, to adapt, to change, and to grow and scale that across other parts of his life. As did I when I started to really understand my truest and greatest capabilities.
As I close out this one segment or episode, I want to leave you with the fact and the recognition of the fact that we are all in survival mode. Whether you're actually executing life at a much higher level or at a lower level, we are all simply surviving. Some of us are surviving better than others, but we are all survival mode, and therefore we're all having to learn how to adapt more effectively to be able to survive within this new environment, post-COVID and beyond. We all need to know the formula for how do we get through this situation and to be able to minimize the risk associated with where we are and where we will be in 5-10 years, and then maximize the opportunity with respect to where we potentially can be, because we all have that potential. So what are you looking around but yet not observing because you're not conscious of where you are? You're not observing where you're going to be in 5-10 years, and therefore you're not taking the pieces of information in that can help you to assemble those pieces into a solution that solves problems for you and possibly for the rest of humanity. Where are you at in your search? Where are you at in your understanding and comprehension of the things around you, the conscious thought? Thanks again for coming into the station. Truly appreciate it. If you like this, hit like. Please also subscribe. Love to hear more and love to see your comments. Cheers.